Most of the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that you consume are generally absorbed within about 30 minutes after reaching the small intestines. Any material that is not absorbed by the time it reaches the end of the ileum, or the last portion of the small intestine, passes through something called the ileocecal valve, and then into the large intestine, or the colon. The large intestine is about 5 feet long, and all of the remaining food items or intestinal material that enters the colon is still in a liquid form. But by the time it reaches the end of the colon, also called the sigmoid colon, the material is solid or semi-solid. This is because the large intestine is the main site for water reabsorption and for the reabsorption of electrolytes. Overall, it can take anywhere from 12 to 70 hours for the food remnants to pass all the way through the colon, and waste products are eventually excreted as fecal matter through the anal canal. Now, your body composition overall is highly influenced by the digestion and absorption of the nutrients from the food you eat. So what's next? After the nutrients are taken up into the small intestine cells, where do they go? Do they just hang out there, or do they move somewhere else? Well, there are actually several answers to this question, several extremely detailed answers. Let's begin with carbohydrates. Through digestion, more complex carbohydrates are eventually broken down into individual units known as monosaccharides. The 3 monosaccharides are glucose, galactose, and fructose, with the most common being glucose. Now, as we talked about earlier, most nutrients are absorbed somewhere along the length of the small intestine, through the brush border and into the intestinal cells. And carbohydrates are absorbed very efficiently and are usually cleared of the small intestine more quickly than fats or proteins. Remember I mentioned earlier that carbs make less demand on the body's metabolism than proteins. Well, glucose is absorbed in the small intestinal cells by a protein complex called the sodium glucose transporter. This is an active process, meaning that energy, or adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is required to make this happen. And after the glucose is absorbed into the intestinal cells, it is then transported out of the cell and into the bloodstream. Now, some of the glucose simply diffuses into the blood, but a carrier protein called GLUT2 transports much of the glucose from the intestinal cell into the blood. Now, once glucose enters the blood, it goes directly to your liver. This is called portal circulation. The liver is the main site of glucose metabolism, so it gets first choice on what to do with the incoming glucose. It can use it, store it, or simply let it move on. And any glucose that is not metabolized or used by the liver passes through to systemic or whole body circulation. From here, glucose travels to various other tissues where it can be taken up through a facilitated transport process using other transport proteins before it is used within that tissue. Next, we have fat. Now, digestion of fat begins in the mouth by the action of the enzyme called lingual lipase, and only very small amounts are broken down in the stomach. The bulk of triglyceride, or fat, digestion occurs in the small intestine. So before fats are broken into their component parts, they first must be emulsified by bile. Well, bile is produced in your liver, but stored in your gallbladder. And essentially, fats have to enter the aqueous environment of the small intestine. But fats are hydrophobic or water-fearing, so emulsification by bile helps fat break apart into smaller lipid droplets that can exist in the small intestine before being broken down. You may have heard of emulsification if you've tried to mix an oil and a vinegar salad dressing. They always separate. But if you add an emulsifier, you can get them to mix and play nice together. It's that bile that allows fat to play nice in the small intestine. So once fat is present in the small intestine, a hormone called cholecystokinin, or CCK, is secreted. And then bile is released through the bile ducts into the small intestine, and the emulsification process begins. And once emulsified, the pancreatic lipase acts on the fats and further breaks them into smaller units that can be absorbed and transported for use. Now, unlike carbohydrates, fats are a little tricky when it comes to their absorption and transportation. They are naturally insoluble in water, and because of this, they cannot move through the brush border into the blood as an individual lipid unit. So to solve this problem, broken down fat particles mix with bile salts and form a water-soluble substance called a micelle. This micelle then interacts at the brush border of the small intestine, and fat particles move out of the micelle and into the intestinal cell, and the water-soluble bile salts continue down through the small intestine until they are reabsorbed and sent back to your liver. So, after the broken down fat particles, which includes free fatty acids, monoglycerides, and some cholesterol, and phospholipid particles in the intestinal cell or enterocyte, they actually reform or combine back together into a larger original triglyceride form. Now, you might ask, what's the point of breaking the fats down just to have them put back together again? Kind of sounded pointless, doesn't it? Well, the only way that fats can be absorbed out of the small intestine is in their smallest, most broken down form. But now they need to be transported. Well, as we noted earlier, fats are not only broken down differently than carbohydrates, they also travel differently. Fats must travel through the lymph system instead of the blood. The lymphatic system is a network of vessels that transports nutrients of the cells and collects cell waste products. The only way fats can travel out of the intestine and into the lymph is by combining into particles known as chylomicrons. Now, the reformed fats combine with fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, or vitamin K, and a protein layer to form the full chylomicron. The chylomicron serves as the carrier for all digested fats that come from the food you eat. And when these chylomicrons are formed, they leave the intestinal cell and move into the lymphatic system. In a slow process, these fats move out into the lymphatic vessels and eventually into your blood, where they freely travel to tissues to deliver fats for use or for storage. Some fat will be used by your muscle cells to produce energy, and some will be deposited into your fat cells. There are many things that can affect how fats are used and stored, including when you last ate, your overall calorie intake for the day, your exercise habits, and how physically fit you are. I'll discuss this much more later in the course. Now, because this transportation process for fats is relatively slow and somewhat individualized, it could take anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours after you eat a high-fat meal for your blood lipids to reach the highest level. After about 5 to 6 hours from your meal, however, the chylomicrons will have delivered the fats to the designated tissues, and your blood levels should return back to normal. Now, our last macronutrient to discuss is protein. The structure of protein is very complex. Remember, we talked about the digestion of protein making more demands on your body's metabolism. Well, that's because of the complexity of protein. Proteins stay fully intact until they get into your stomach. And large proteins are broken down into individual amino acids in the stomach by the very acidic stomach juice. And proteins that are still intact after leaving the stomach are broken down further in the top portion of the small intestine. The end products of protein digestion are free amino acids, which are absorbed into your intestinal cells. Now, proteins are absorbed in a process more similar to carbohydrates than that of fats. And this process occurs along the entire length of the small intestine. Amino acids, just like glucose, require sodium-dependent carriers to get them into your intestinal cells. Now, there are several uses for particular amino acids within the intestinal cell. However, amino acids that are not used within the intestinal cells themselves are transported out of those cells and into the blood and make their first stop at your liver. About 50 to 65% of all of the ingested amino acids are metabolized in your liver. The rest of the amino acids are used in other tissues, particularly the skeletal muscles, your kidneys, and the brain. In fact, these amino acids are used by skeletal muscle, for example, to directly repair muscle, or maintain muscle mass, or even help with growth of muscle, and especially if it's combined with the proper exercise routine. It is the skeletal muscle mass that has a huge influence on your muscle mass and your body fat ratio. And the entire process of digestion and absorption is important to understand because it can determine how the food you eat makes you feel, and the food you eat is ultimately stored as body fat or glycogen or used as energy. Now that we have discussed macronutrients, digestion, absorption, and transportation in detail, I want to touch briefly on the micronutrients. So while it's the macronutrients' job to provide the body with energy, micronutrients, on the other hand, do not provide direct energy. However, they are vital in order to make all of the digestive processes occur, along with hundreds of other reactions and processes within the body. So the micronutrients are involved with energy production, but they just do not directly provide energy. The water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C and the B-complex vitamins, are absorbed and transported through the blood. With the exception of vitamin B12, which can be stored in your body for several years, water-soluble vitamins are not stored in your body for long periods of time. They are either used very quickly in the body or excreted in the urine. So we need to get them from the food we eat. Fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamins A, D, E, and K, are absorbed and transported very similarly to fats. They need to be packaged into the micelles to be absorbed and transported by chylomicrons throughout the lymph. Now, unlike water-soluble vitamins, excess fat-soluble vitamins can be stored in the body for a decent amount of time. And for this reason, fat-soluble vitamin deficiencies are much less common than water-soluble vitamin deficiencies. So back to the question about breakfast. As you can now understand, quite a bit happens inside your body after you take that first bite of your breakfast. For the most part, the GI tract of a healthy individual works like a well-oiled machine. Along with the digestive system itself, the endocrine and the nervous system play a major role in regulating digestion, absorption, and transportation of the nutrients. And the GI tract is really amazing. I mean, unfortunately, as people start to age, some functions of these systems begin to slow down. And the main cause for these changes is that the degeneration of something called the enteric nervous system. And this is the nervous system specifically for the GI tract. The enteric nervous system controls muscle contractions in the esophagus and the stomach and the colon. And when it degenerates, the movements of food and food-like products through the GI tract usually slows down. And this can lead to serious GI complications, including dysphagia, which is a swallowing difficulty, GI reflux, and even constipation. And gastric acid secretions can also be minimized with age, leading to bacterial overgrowth and inflammation. So along with biological and nervous system complications, elderly individuals may experience what has come to be known as anorexia of aging.